If you're watching this video, Behavior Part 2, I'm assuming you watched Behavior Part 1. If you haven't, please do, because I'll be making some references back to Chris, who is a big part of that first video. And I'll be making references to him in this video, and he'll be wanting my references will make sense, of course, unless you've seen that. Where I want to go with this video is I want to start going into more detail in regards to specific discipline practices that we use and really why they don't work so well and kind of the challenge that's there. And just kind of look at them in a little bit more detail and look at what's really involved in making things work, specifically with children with histories of trauma, children with histories of just of abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. I'll tell you, I remember when my son, Christian, my birth son, when he was a little guy, about 5 or 6 years old, I remember going or coming to the grocery store, we're at the grocery store in the parking lot, and this kid, he gets into his head and darts out the parking lot. I call his name, and I don't know how this boy got to his head. But somehow this kid gets into his head that he doesn't have to listen to his old man. And so I'm like 3 steps behind him. I snatch the little boy, I pop him on the butt, and you think it's the end of the world. Now, when I popped my son on the butt, do you think it had the impact on him that I wanted it to have? Okay, I want to confess, it did. Next time I said that little boy, son, please hold your dad's hand, guess what he did? He held my hand. Not an argument. But there's a reason that worked with him. The reason that worked with him was not that the pain, it wasn't a hard pop. But now you would have thought it was the way he cried out. But the power of when I engaged him in that way was really the surprise of it. Because he's not a child of abuse. He's not a child of trauma. In fact, for him, these are hands that love that kid. I mean, these hands that squeeze that boy, that hold him, that tickle him, that wrestle with him, that throw him in the air, and they usually catch him. I know, bad dad joke. But the point is, these are hands that love him. He sees his hands, and the power of that was him saying, "What's going on here?" This was a change in character, and he understood. Dad's serious here. Something's going on here that's different, and he just had to get a guy's attention. That's basically what it was for. Getting his attention and immediately working, and it can work fine with him because he's my birth kid, and he knows I love him. And he's not a kid of trauma. But could you imagine if I was in that same parking lot? And imagine if I'm with Chris, who I was talking about in the previous video. Imagine if I'm with Chris and Chris takes off in that parking lot and I call his name, he ignores me, and I try to snatch and pop that kid. Could you imagine? It would be devastating. That kid, who knows how he would respond? Multiple ways. Then he goes into rage mode and just starts having a full-blown tantrum and starts trying to just go the panic rage that he would go into. Or maybe he just goes into his dissociation that I mentioned, how he would just disappear into Willy Land and we don't have him for a day. Or maybe this kid, he becomes like a little gingerbread man and takes off running, and I'm too fat and old to chase a little boy. And who knows what will happen. With this little kid, because of his history, I can't engage him that way. There's no way I can engage him that way. Or imagine if today I go to the grocery store. When I'm at the grocery store, this car pulls up beside me in the parking lot. A young lady gets out, a young mother gets out, her little girl gets out, her little girl darts out the parking lot. And the young mother, she calls for her daughter, and the little girl ignores her. And me, being the good Samaritan that I am, I decide I'm going to help her. And so I snatch her daughter, pop her on the butt, bring her back to mama. Could you imagine the impact of that? Yeah, jail time. And I probably deserve it. That little girl, she may have never had trauma in her life. She likely does now. Because I have no relationship with her. I have no connection with her. And now this little girl, she may have, for the foreseeable future, a fear of old white guys and bearded white guys, fat bearded white guys, in parking lots because of that action there. Now, there are other things I can try and do to help. But I can't, there's no way I could engage in that way. It'd be a very wrong way. I could not do it. So what exactly are we talking about when I say there are things that we can do and we can't do? And what I want to do is I want to look at, think about some ways, some traditional ways of discipline that we've done over the years. We all have done that. Well, we already kind of mentioned one, spank. Another one we say yell, maybe even lecture. I'm out, right? Very common, take away, loss of privileges. I think what else? Grounding. And I'll add one more. What about chores? And so spank. Well, we've already, now I'm going to use Chris as an example. He's an extreme example, but that's why I'm using him. Would I dare use spank or any form of physical punishment with Chris? Heck no, no way. I would not do it. It just would not work with him. I will go ahead and say this, so just in case, if you're in the process of becoming a foster parent or you're wanting to adopt from foster, until you have officially adopted a kid, you have to understand you cannot use physical punishments with children who are in the system. Can't do it. Easy way to get in trouble. What about yell or lecture with Chris? What's he going to hear? I'm reminded of the old cartoon, Charlie Brown, Peanuts, and the teacher. Whenever he was in the classroom, you hear the teacher say, "Well, why? You didn't hear." Well, that's what Chris hears. He doesn't hear anything. Yelling or even lecture just really doesn't work with him. Um, Time out. What about time out with Chris? Now you may be thinking, isn't that kind of what Claire did? In that in that situation I was describing where she had to remove him from the Walmart. They're sitting there in the van. That's kind of a form of timeout. I would probably call that more of a time in, and I'll talk about kind of the difference and maybe talk about the difference in that later. But when I'm talking about timeout, what I'm talking about is that when we're sending our kid off to a room, send them off to their bedroom or somewhere else, just get them out of our sight. Well, again, Chris was an extreme kid, but I'll go ahead and tell you, if you do that with Chris, you better be ready to go in there later with spatula and putty to repair the walls. Remember how I described him? When Chris was in rage mode, he was a force of destruction. I remember that poor family, man. This kid, he destroyed everything. The holes in the wall. This kid destroyed the bed, destroyed the dresser. I think one time they had one of those little lights kind of came down. Somehow he got to that thing, destroyed that thing. I remember poor family. The foster father, man, Billy got so frustrated with rebuilding beds because this kid was always destroying the bed. He's always having to put it back together. He got so frustrated. Well, Billy was a welder, and eventually he welds together his metal bed frame and bolts that thing to the floor. Chris is an adult and gone now. That bed's still there. That thing lasted. Timeout, not with Chris. Again, something like time in with what you need with him, and we may get a chance to talk about that a little bit more. Takeaway. Well, let me ask you a quick question. In regards to Chris's history, what could you possibly take away from a kid who's experienced rape, who's experienced such intense physical abuse, who's experienced the loss of their family? What could you actually take away that's bigger than anything they've already had taken They've lost everything. These kids have lost, our kids and kids have lost everything. They just simply have. With Chris, again, in takeaway, I'll tell you an interesting thing, and this kind of fits with the description of what I was giving you of him. I remember when it came to his toys and things, the foster parent, foster mom, when Chris was finished playing with his toys, the foster mom always put them somewhere where he couldn't get to. She would either get them up high or had a locked box where he couldn't get to them. That sounds horribly mean, but she wasn't doing that out of meanness. She was doing that out of love because Chris was a kid of rage. And when he would go into his rages, he wasn't selective. He destroyed everything. He destroyed his toys. He destroyed just everything. It didn't matter what, because he just went to a blindness about it. And she put his stuff up. He wouldn't have anything. He simply wouldn't have anything. So takeaway for Chris, really, it doesn't have meaning. And that is a real challenge. By the way, with a lot of kids in foster care, is things don't have meaning. So it doesn't have quite the same power. Grounding. Okay, well, let me ask you: is Chris going anywhere anyway? No, he's not going anywhere. This kid, he's effectively grounded. But when we think of grounding, generally what we're talking about is not what's going on right now, not immediately. What we tend to be talking about is a punishment, a discipline tomorrow, like the weekend, Friday's coming, or the weekend's coming, or there's a special event coming. And what we tend to be talking about in grounding is a punishment tomorrow for something that happened yesterday. Well, the problem with that is that you will discover kids with intense histories of trauma, physical abuse, is that they don't connect the dots. It's interesting. I don't know if we ended up doing another video talking about brain impact of trauma and these things. But there have been studies that have shown for our kids who have these histories of intense physical trauma, and emotional trauma, abusive trauma in their lives, and the impact on the brain is that it just impacts the brain, meaning that there are areas of the brain that are just kind of dark. They just don't light up the way they should. They're not. It often looks like traumatic brain injury, and the dots are just not there. And the problem with like a kid like Chris is, man, if you're punishing tomorrow for something that happened yesterday, he's not connected. Tomorrow's a brand new day. He doesn't hardly remember yesterday. He's not connecting that. And so it doesn't have the impact you're wanting it to have. It's just, it's like we're being mean towards kids. So it just doesn't really work. Chores. Now, when I talk about chores, I'm not talking about those basic chores that we do as a family, teaching a child responsibility. I'm talking about those chores that we do with a child, and basically as a punishment, for something they've done. Well, chores. Well, let me ask you: do you want your dishes in Chris's hands? I'm going to guess no. Do you want a yard tool in Chris's hand? Again, no. None of these things tend to work really well with Chris. Now, let me say this. I may end up doing a third video. I wouldn't necessarily remove all of these things. But I'm as far as tools that we would use, but we would need to look at ways to make them more effective. Absolutely. Because some of them we just can't use at all. Spanking, yelling, lecturing, it's just not going to really work at all. But some of these we could use, but we'd have to look at how we approach it, how we deal to make it an effective tool a little bit. But in regards to Chris and just our presentation, they just don't work very well, if at all. And again, in some cases, just kind of make the situation even worse. Now, here's the thing, though. When it came to my birth kids, probably were fine for the most part. Spank, now, for my kids, go ahead and say, is incredibly rare. The main thing they ever would get popped for or spanked for would be if they're doing something that's going to electrocute themselves or burn themselves on the stove. And I just need to get their attention to make sure they're really young. When if they start getting older, you kind of need to be away from that anyway. But yeah, that spank, with my kids probably worked fine. Yell or lecture. It's funny, with my daughters, I go ahead and say I never yelled because they were such gentle souls. My son took a little bit more to get his attention sometimes, but he just kind of boys can be kind of hard headed, it seems. Um, but they were fine because the things is when I call my kids, well, my again, it's always gentle with them. But with my kids, they never heard "I hate you" if I was calling their attention. When they heard some frustration, they weren't hearing just the end of "I hate you forever." They didn't hear that. They knew I love them because we had this tie, this attachment, this relation. They're not kids of trauma. In regards to lecture, oh my God, I'll confess up because my ex will probably never see these videos. But my ex was the queen of lectures, queen of lectures. It seems like she thought thought these our kids were always doing something wrong. And by the way, my kids were amazingly good. They were always really good. But I'd watch her. She'd be kind of needing to kind of march them off to the back bedroom because she felt like they needed to hear about something. And I would kind of wave at them. Yeah, it was kind of mean. But she caught me one time. And you know what happens when the wife catches you being silly and goofy like that? Makes you the enforcer. You got to go in there and sit into it also. And so that was a mistake on her part. Though. So I'm sitting there. She gave this lecture, and I mean I got to tell you, I have the attention span of a flea. Giving these trainings for me, easy for me to run my mouth, easy for me to talk. Sitting there and listening, whew, that's a whole nother challenge. And she would start on one of her lectures, and I'd be like 5 seconds into it, and I'd pick up very quickly. Oh my God, this is never going to end. Like we're here forever, and I'm dying in there. And at one time, and I was being silly, and I shouldn't have been, but being the goofball that I am sometimes, I said to her, I looked at her, I said, Edith, just just beat them, just beat them. I said, you'll feel better. I'll feel better. They'll feel better, won't you? And of course, my kids knew I was being goofy and silly. I wasn't being serious in this, and they chimed right in. Yes, we'll feel better too. You know. And I got from that point on. Of course, I got officially banned from sitting in from the lectures, which was good for me, but not so good for them. Sadly, later, another time later, I would hear she would be marching the kids back there, and I'd hear my son later, just beat me, just beat me. Oh my God, what have I done? You know. um, anyways, when it came to time out, look, my kids were fine with that. If I need to say, you guys need to take a breather, or even if I said, Dad needs a breather from this, my kids did not hear me saying, I hate you, get out of my face, I never want to see you again. Because that wasn't my kids' history. They knew my love for them. They knew their mom's love for them. They knew our love for them. And they, we were telling them they need to take a time out or take a break. It wasn't the end of the world. Time out was fine. Takeaway, my kids did fine with takeaway. Why? Because my kids have healthy attachments in their life. And so takeaway, and we had an abundance of things we could use with takeaway, especially for this generation. You have what you have, girls, go ahead and tell you the best tool in the world. Phones, cell phones, best tool in the world, takeaway. Little boys, I'll go ahead and tell you, video games, awesome tool, because there's so many things I like. Grounding was fine with my birth kids. Why? Because they connected the dots. They're not kids of trauma. So when something happened, weekend came, Friday or weekend, they wanted to go do something, and we said, hold on, you did this. Well, they connected the dots fine. It wasn't a problem. And even chores, we didn't really use them very often, but it was a matter of just my kids connected the dots. They're not kids of trauma. Your birth kids probably connected the dots. When your parents did this stuff, you probably did fine. But this doesn't really work well, kids. We have a history of trauma and abuse. And what we're talking about, what it is about this that doesn't work well is this. What we're talking about when we're talking about these discipline styles is what we're actually doing is what I would refer to as reactive discipline. Let me write it here. Reactive. What do I mean? Well, basically, what we're doing is our kid has done something wrong, and in response to what they're doing wrong, we are engaging a discipline, right? That's generally how this plays out. And now, are we doing this because we want our kids to be in pain and to suffer? No, we're trying to teach them something. The idea behind reactive discipline is, we're just with our kids, is we're saying, look, you just did something. You did something really wrong. You knew it was wrong, and there's a cost. There's a cost to this that you've got to pay, and it's whatever. And we're saying, my hope is that due to the cost, due to you having to pay this cost, that the next time that you're thinking about doing what you just did, that you'll think better of it, that you won't do it. And we do this because we're thinking that they're going to learn from this, they'll engage it, and often our kids do fine with that. In our birth families, no history of trauma, but there's a reason they do this. There's a reason they pick up, and the reason they pick up on this is because we've already done something with them that we don't even realize. We've already done the proactive. We've already done the proactive part. What do I mean by this? Well, see, now our kids grew up in our homes. They know our language. They know the rules. But here's what they also know. They know what they're not supposed to do, but they also know what they're supposed to do. With our kids, they know that when we say no, we're saying, we don't want you doing this, but we do want you doing this. This is how we want you to respond. And so with our birth view, we're at a point, because they know the language of our home, they know the language of our family, they know what we're talking about, they know what they're supposed to be doing. Problem is, we get a kid with this history of trauma, or this kid who comes into foster care, this kid that we're adopting, all they hear is the no, but they don't hear the other part of this. And so the reactive part, it just doesn't really work with them. But the key is, with our birth kids, we've already done it because we've been doing it their whole lives. We've been doing the proactive, teaching it to them what they are supposed to do their whole lives. And so, well, what does this mean then? What does this look like? Well, this is what we now have to do with this child, with this history that comes into our lives, is we now have to engage in something that was never engaged in. And this is a part we don't often think about. So what does this look like? I'll give you kind of a quick picture of this. Behavioral 101. When to be proactive really involves two steps. Okay. The first step is the simple step, right? What we don't want. Well, that's usually going to be pretty clear. We don't want you yelling, don't want you screaming, don't want you fighting, don't want you picking, don't want you, and the list goes on and on and on of those things that don't want. Now, with our birth kids, that translates to no, don't. We're often fine with that. With our kids who are new to us, we got to be very specific. It's not don't be bad. It's don't do. We don't want them doing something very, very specific. And we're usually fine with this part of it. The problem is we need to have this next part thought through. Well, here's what we don't want. The question is, well, what then? What is it that we do want? In other words, we don't want that kid cursing. Well, how do we want them to talk? We don't want them hitting. How do we want them to? We don't want them interrupting me on the phone. Then what do I want him to do when I'm on the phone? We don't. Again, goes on and on. We have to think the other side of this thing, because what we have to start teaching our kid is what is the expectation, and start chasing that down. Okay. Now, sounds like a lot of work, doesn't it? It can be. It is a lot. A lot of this we've done without even thinking about it, so it's not quite as complicated as we think. But it does take some thinking. Let me give you just kind of a quick, simple example of this, kind of how this works out. So let's say that we were in a classroom, okay, a large classroom, all present, 30, 40 people. You don't know these people, all strangers, but we're in this formal classroom. And when we're in this classroom, I'm giving one of my wonderful lectures, going on and on, as I tend to do. And I ask a question. And when I ask this question, you hear the question, and you're like amazed with excitement, because you know the answer. You're like, oh my God, I got it. I got the answer for this. and you're dying to share. You want the whole world to know you got the answer. So in this large classroom with all these people, what are you probably going to do to let me know and let the class know that you have an answer? Well, chances are you're going to raise that hand. You're going to pick me, pick me. That's because our school system has indoctrinated us well. We understand in polite society when we're in a group or in a setting of a lot of people and we have something we want to say, we raise our hand. That's the rule, right? Well, let's say that you're pretty sure I saw you, but I don't call on you. I call on someone way in the back of the class. Well, you're disappointed, but you're thinking you let it go because you're thinking yeah, it's a big class. Everybody, you got to give everybody a chance. Oh, it's disappointing, but it is what it is. Then you let it go. Well, later as I'm going on in my lecture, I have another question. I put out another question. And man, if you thought the first one was great, you're like, oh my gosh, this is better than the first one. And you're so excited because you have the best answer in the world. And so your hand goes up. And I saw you. There's no way I didn't see you. Of course I saw you. You're the only one raising your hand. But instead of calling on you, you're calling this guy beside you. Now your feelings get a little bit more hurt now. But you're thinking, all right, that's Fred. Fred hasn't had a right answer all day. Kevin's just being nice to him, and you let it go. Well, if this keeps going on, and I keep asking questions, and I don't call on you, guess what will eventually disappear? This will disappear. You'll stop doing it. It's simply not working, and you're feeling foolish. Your feelings hurt. You just stop doing it. It's just not doing anything. Well, let's say I'm going on and finally I ask a question, and this is like the golden goose of questions. You hear this, you're like, oh my God. And you hear this and you're so excited to answer, but you got a problem. I'm not calling on you. You know that I'm not recognizing your hand. So what are you likely going to do? Because you're determined, you're giving an answer this time. What might you do? Well, one of a million things, limited only by your imagination. You might yell it out, blurt it out. You may throw that water bottle at me, make sure you got my attention. You may decide, well, Kevin doesn't need the answer. Fred needs the answer. And so you decide to give Fred the answer, turn to your neighbor to talk to him, give him your answer. You may just get angry, grab all your stuff, throw it in your bag and say, enough of this, and just storm out of the room. Now, I have eliminated hand raising, but I have opened the door on a whole host of other behaviors, limited again only by your imagination. So open the door. Well, let's say beginning of a class, big classroom. I'm walking in and I say, guys, I got to tell you, I don't know what's going on with me. I got my eyes checked today. I can't see. They put something in my eyeballs. I can't see a darn thing today. I'm going crazy. I want to hear your thoughts, though. I want to hear your answers. I want you to talk to me about things. Do me a favor. Whenever you have something you want to share with me, so I can call on you, do this. Knock on the table in front of you. Knock on the table in front of you. Now, if I want that knock on the table to become the behavior of my class, what had I better do for the whole class? I already did part of it, didn't I? What did I do? Well, one, I gave you a reasonable explanation for why I want you to do something different. It wasn't complicated. I didn't go into a lecture or anything. I just gave you a reasonable explanation for simple explanation. And then what I do? I demonstrated for you. I gave you an example, a demonstration of exactly what I wanted you to do. Now, What had I better do for the rest of the class? You're right. Every time you or anybody else knocks on that desk, knocks on that table in front of you, I better catch you. Even if you're goofing off, even if you're just trying to test me to see if I'm paying attention, I need to show you, yes, I'm paying attention. Every time you knock on that desk, I need to acknowledge, I need to catch you doing it every time. Right? But let's say that my eyes weren't as bad as I said they were. And let's say that Fred over there, Fred, he raises his hand and I see it. Well, what had I better not do? Yeah, you got it. I better not recognize that hand. I better not call him that hand. Why? Because that hand is the pre-programmed behavior. And if I call him that hand, guess what's going to happen? That's right. For the rest of this class, Fred is not going to knock on that desk. Fred is going to raise his hand. Fact of the matter is, not only is Fred going to raise his hand, the whole classroom is going to raise their hand because that is the pre-program. That is the program that's already there. That is our fallback to. That's the thing we do. We've been doing our whole lives. And so and that's behavioralism 101 in a nutshell. The behaviors that I really want to get away from, I want to start turning away from, be able to turn a blind eye from. But for them to do what I want them to do, I have got to start teaching it, and then I got to start catching it every single time. I know there's a little bit of an oversimplification. I got you. A lot more work to it than that, but that's the idea in a nutshell of what it is. Coming to the end of this section, I'll talk to probably later down the road. I'm going to do a part 3, and when I do a part 3, where I will go with that is I'll start talking about making some of these more effective, and I'll talk about maybe some other ways to kind of help and engage a little bit. That said, I'm going to go ahead and say this now. I may have said in the first video if I didn't. Now's as good time as any. There are no silver bullets, meaning that there isn't just one thing that fixes everything. It doesn't exist. I mean, if I had that silver bullet, I'd be at Barnes and Noble selling my books, but it doesn't exist. Every child is unique in their design and their history and how this stuff plays out. But I hope this helps you in understanding why some things don't work and kind of where our focus has to be to getting things that do work. And it is a lot of work. There's no getting around. It'd be a lot easier, a lot better if we had done this when the kid was that whole 0 to 3, 0 to 5 would have been an ideal time to start working on the program. Often what this involves is a lot of repetition. And let me add one more thought to that in saying that often the main complaint I'll hear from foster families and even with adopted families, but many of the therapeutic foster families, I hear, well, he knows this. I've repeated myself. He knows this. And then I go right back to it. It's not if he's a kid of trauma. I mean, he knows it, maybe, but the program's not here yet. It's not in here yet. Anyway, and what that translates is that I do have to repeat myself again and again and again, because it's not a one-time fix as this. Well, he's a teenager. Yeah, he's a teenager with a history of abuse, a teenager with a history of trauma. And that means the wiring is a little different because of the history and life events. We've got to approach it a little different. Anyway, I hope this helps you a little bit. And anyway, be blessed.